Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm your host, Sri Krishna Upadhyaya, and my guest today on the show is Bharat Reddy, my colleague at Takshashila. Welcome to All Things Policy, Bharat.
Thanks, Sri. Great to be here.
So today, Bharat and I are going to be talking about Reserve Bank of India's e-mandate restrictions upon card companies and banks. These restrictions essentially came into force from October 1st of 2021. What do these payment restrictions mean? In case any merchant has to process card not present transactions, also called CNP transactions, where essentially you're using your credit card or a debit card to make an online purchase, or you need to undergo two-factor authentication. So the e-mandate notification requires that recurring payments can be carried out only and only after a registration has been done using OTP for the first instance, and the first transaction has also been completed using a OTP. And later on, from the second transaction onwards, recurring payment can proceed seamlessly by means of auto debit. However, these restrictions have been causing a lot of issues, and especially with international payments. So, Bharat, would you like to talk a little bit about the issues that customers, merchants, businesses are facing due to these payment restrictions imposed by RBI? And maybe begin by talking about why this mandate came into force in the first place.
So when you're talking about problems are being faced with international payments, so all of the other problems have kind of been sorted out after a couple of months of this regulation coming into effect. But international payments is something that's still not working seamlessly. So now imagine that you're trying to subscribe to something on an international platform. Say it could be an app, it could be, say, a news portal or a VPN service, something like that. And you need to pay for it using a recurring subscription. And you use your Indian credit card or debit card. And most likely it'll be rejected. Now, so this is because of the requirements that RBI has put, that it needs to be compliant with this framework where you need to send a notification to the user 24 hours before. If the payment is larger than 5,000 rupees, then threshold has been raised to 15,000. But if it is greater than that threshold, then you need an OTP every time you make that recurring transaction. So now a lot of the international merchants are not compliant with these regulations. Now, so one way to get around this is to say, if that service has an app, then you install that app, and but then you're very likely to pay a 30% markup because there's a commission that Google or Apple charge for in-app payments. The other alternative could be to mail these vendors every month, and ask them for a one-time payment link that you can use to complete that transaction. Now, so this is obviously a very big overhead, and most people would not prefer, engage in this kind of a transaction every month. Now, it's been 1.5 years since this has been introduced. Now, during the first few months, even the domestic transactions had a lot of problems. So you were seeing payments failing for a lot of businesses, for a lot of subscriptions. Small businesses were really hurt. And this has been but all of those have been sorted at the domestic level. It's still the international ones which are not working. Now, when you look at why this was introduced in the first place, for most subscriptions, you would have noticed that the enrollment process is really simple. You just enter your personal information, you enter your card details, and you have access to it. You are able to access the service and all of that. Now, but when you need to unsubscribe yourself, so you'll see that there's no unsubscribe button in most cases. You'll have to send a mail to them asking them to terminate the subscription, and it's not a very straightforward process, and it's been deliberately made complicated so that people subscribe to something and they remain subscribed forever, right? And you also might have experienced that there's a free trial for a month which some service offers. Now, this free trial, you're asked to provide your credit card details and all that, and you were told that it's a free trial and you will not be charged. But at the end of that trial, a lot of people might forget to unsubscribe from the service, and then every month there'll be a recurring payment that will be going on, unless you realize that this is happening and you go and unsubscribe from that service. Now, this kind of a thing has been a concern that has been raised by a lot of people, and RBI's intention was to help customers keep track of their subscriptions, notify them of these transactions that are happening, recurring transactions whenever they happen, and to exit unwanted ones. Now, so even though these intentions might have been good, so the impact of these regulations, it's a mixed bag. So you see that there's been a lot of pain that's come for a lot of different stakeholders in this entire value chain, right? So now this value chain starts from the customers who are purchasing something, and then you have the banks who are facilitating that transaction through the credit cards. Then you have mandate processing platforms which were built after the RBI regulations were introduced. So these basically were made in charge of sending these notifications to the users and reminding them of when these payments are due. And then you have the payment aggregators and then the merchants. So in this entire value chain, all of them need to align with these regulations. And this coordination between all of them has not been a very seamless process. So there was a long period of time between when all these banks and payment aggregators and these mandate processing platforms were all not compliant. And so a lot of payments were failing, and this disrupted businesses. It's an overhead for consumers. So a lot of different fallout of these regulations being introduced.
Right. So just to add a little bit to the background that you described and also sort of recap what you said. So essentially, the RBI found that, you should have an additional layer of security and validation before processing any transaction. And this had to come from information which was not present on the card itself, right? Like your CVV number or card number. Other than that, so the idea of OTP was introduced. And of course, initially, the companies had to adjust to this regime. And now, as you mentioned, things have smoothened out, but problems persist. And RBI has also sort of understood this and has increased the limit for OTP, every month OTP from 5,000 to 15,000. So that has been a development. And additionally, I think now e-mandates are also allowed for UPI-based transactions, but they have to undergo a similar process of registration using a two-factor authentication and a first transaction where also you require an OTP. And from the second transaction onwards, the process is automatic. Now, the question essentially is when you mention that, from a security perspective, I get it, right? Like OTP has a certain value. But when you say that the intention was also that, to protect consumers from making bad choices. Like, for example, I subscribe to something and I forget to unsubscribe later on and I lose, say, $200 every month. I mean, that's personally my fault, right? In the sense, like, I don't know why the regulator is so interested in overhauling the whole system just to protect me from making those decisions, in the sense that, this overprotectiveness, this overzealousness can cause problems, like you have mentioned. And the other thing also is that, a lot of businesses which were relying on subscription revenue, I think you mentioned that they have had a hard impact because it's again a behavioral thing, right? I might, out of my altruism, want to make a monthly donation of 500 rupees to certain charity or an establishment that I want to donate to. And I suddenly find that I have to make this every month. I have to put in an OTP and make a particular transaction happen. Now that creates a lot of friction, and it's human behavior, right? If I'm asked to take additional workload to make this happen, I might end up not doing it. So I think that is one of the impact. So just getting a little deeper into the impact, Bharat. So how has it sort of impacted different stakeholders here? Like, of course, from the example that I gave of donations, how have other subscription-based businesses fared? And how have international businesses or service providers responded to this kind of restrictions?
So yeah, like you mentioned, the biggest impact has been on small enterprises which depend on revenue from subscriptions or donations for their day-to-day or monthly operations, right? Now, there were instances when, for example, subscription-driven platforms, I know of a couple of platforms that vocal about raising this issue, that their revenues had dwindled to next to nothing. So, for example, Internet Freedom Foundation had raised this as an issue when suddenly their subscriptions had, fallen drastically when these regulations kicked into effect. News Laundry, which is another subscription-based news platform, was one more which was also raising this concern that suddenly they saw the revenue from subscription falling drastically. So these kind of subscriber-driven platforms, and which are small and, they were the most severely hit. Even the bigger ones, which like your OTT platforms or news organizations or cloud services. So all of these were also impacted. So you would see that a Netflix or a New York Times or any of these things which have a monthly subscription model, all of them would have to comply with these regulations in order to be able to continue their the payments. To make sure that the payments are working. So that was the biggest impact for the businesses. Now, when it comes to the other side, for the customers also, there was a significant overhead. So customers had to manually make these transactions, which were automatically being done till date. Even for a small organization like Takshashila, we would have subscribed to, say, a number of newsletters or software services or a number of things, right? So every month, someone has to manually make these payments and see that these payments are done regularly, and it has to be kept track of. Otherwise, your functioning will get disrupted. Things will come to a standstill, right? So for individuals, for small organizations, this overhead is something that has kind of added a lot of a burden. And even from the businesses, this additional burden of manually processing transactions which were being done automatically is something that adds to the overheads for a lean organization, because someone has to prepare the invoices, see that the transaction is done, follow up with the customers. All of these things have to be done. So these are problems that were faced by the consumers and the businesses. You also see that for a lot of Indians who are subscribing to international content or services, it's just your cards are not being accepted now. So, for example, New York Times has this put up a notice which says that regarding a lot of complaints about declined payments, they have put up a notice which says that you need to use a valid US card to make the payments. So now I don't know how many Indian subscribers have a US credit card, right? It's a lot of different kind of hurdles being faced by all different kinds of stakeholders. Now, even to implement these things, now banks had to be compliant with these mandate processing platforms now, which were implemented by the payment aggregators. For example, you have BillDesk and Razorpay, which were some of the larger payment aggregators. Now, each of these had implemented a mandate processing software or a platform. Now, this kind of a software now had to be compliant with all of the banks that the payments would come from, and only then would the mandate get triggered for that bank, right? Would the notification get triggered for that bank? So a lot of complications that have come about because of having to implement this thing. So, and it's across stakeholders. Like everybody has had some kind of friction which has come about because of this.
Right. And like you rightly mentioned, one can't be expected to have an American card just to purchase services from an American company, right? That's too much to expect. Plus, also, I think the fundamental problem is access to my money, right? In the sense that, once I have a certain amount of money in my account, or I'm using a credit card or service, then I should be allowed to use it freely like I please, and there should not be any disruptions of this kind brought in by regulatory actions which impedes my access to my funds. So having said that, let's pause for a short break here, Bharat, and then we'll come back and continue this conversation on how things could have panned out differently. Welcome back to All Things Policy. We are in conversation about the RBI's mandate for recurring payments, which has created a havoc in the payment system. All the things have smoothened down a little after year or so has passed. However, there are still important policy questions that we need to address in this situation. And first of all is, what were the alternatives that RBI could have adopted in order to solve this particular problem? Because like I think Bharat mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, the fact is all service subscriptions make it incredibly hard for customers to back out once they have opted in, right? If anybody who has ever tried to stop a credit card or even opt out of a credit card know how difficult it is. And most other online subscriptions also today have deliberately increased the friction so that customers find it hard to opt out. These are very real problems, but of course, you could have solved this through other sort of approaches which need not have put the whole system through a very pressing time. So Bharat, What are some of these alternatives that RBI could have looked at? How could the intervention have been different, which sort of protected an individual's right to use the money as they please and also informed them in a better way about what was going on, plus created, less disruption within the system?
So before we get into what could have been the interventions, that alternative intervention that would have been better, a lot of people have questioned whether this was RBI's fight at all to start with, right? So this was, lopsided buyer-seller relationship, which is a consumer protection problem, as Andy Mukherjee says. So a central bank's job is to provide a well-oiled payment system which safeguards the integrity of the financial network from money launderers, terrorists, and so on. Now, RBI should not be going after a Netflix or a New York Times or, going after these kind of things in the first place. So whether this kind of a consumer protection problem is something that RBI should be tackling at all is one question that's being asked a lot, was being raised at the time this came into effect. Now, if you keep that aside, now when something like this is being discussed, so now there were a few problems like we discussed, right? So, but it was working for most people. Now, when you're going to propose such a drastic change, it's very important that you hold open consultations and invite comments from all the stakeholders. For example, TRAI, or the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, has a lot of these kind of practices in place. So they publish white papers, they invite comments from all the different stakeholders, and they take in these comments and incorporate them into the recommendations that they propose. Now, RBI could have a similar process in place where they do these kind of things, engage with the stakeholders so that they can better understand what could be the consequences of bringing such regulation. And it's really difficult, right, for a central bank to, what are the different ways in which different users use some kind of service. Now, when different people are subscribing to different kinds of services, they're using it in different ways. One kind of a regulation might not fit everybody. And also, when something drastic like this is introduced, now the costs will be concentrated on certain individuals or businesses. And for them, it will really be a very significant hit. So one thing is a process thing that they need to hold more open consultations and comments from stakeholders. Another thing would be now that all of this has been implemented to a large extent, but it's very unlikely that the international merchants, who have a very limited Indian customer base, will change their whole infrastructure to comply with the regulations imposed by RBI. Now, for them, the number of Indian customers might be a small subset of their entire customer base. But for the sake of these customers, will they really go and implement this kind of a change in infrastructure? It's very unlikely. So maybe there is something that's some kind of an exemption that needs to be granted so that these kind of transactions can go through, given that we've already put this thing in place and have all of these things, but these kind of international transactions are still failing every time. So maybe there's some exemption that needs to be granted for international payments. So
Right.
these are the few of the recommendations I can think of.
Yeah. Just to add on to that, I also felt a couple of things would help. I think some of it is already a part of the system that RBI envisaged, which is, I don't have a problem with an SMS alerting me each time some debit has taken place on my account. I think that's a good enough nudge for customers to keep an eye on the financial transactions which are being carried on their particular accounts, right? That way, customers can keep a check on what money is being flowing out. And of course, you have your credit card statements, your bank statements, which one is expected to take a look, every monthly or whenever one gets time. And the other thing is, I think RBI is planning to do this, or I don't know if this has already been effectuated, is that, on your banking app or your banking portal, one can easily take a look at all the recurring subscriptions which have been registered on your particular account, and you get to control it from there. I think this is something which RBI has already asked banks to work on, or has already asked them to implement. But I think this was a sufficient and a necessary measure, right? So that at one place you can check, oh, okay, these are the 10 different services I've subscribed to, and just the amount that is going to be debited every month. And maybe I get the opportunity to switch on and off these payments from there, instead of having to go to a particular service provider and try to disable the service from there, and keeping a track of all these 10 different websites and apps. Instead, if I had a single bank list on a banking platform, say a mobile app which you use, I think that would make my life way more easier.
Right. Yeah, completely agree. I don't know if this is in the process, but yeah, this is something that would really help. This is actually how a lot of the subscriptions on your phone work, say your App Store or Play Store that you have on your phone. So those kind of thing already have this in place. So you'll be able to see all of the subscriptions on your phone. You can enable or disable when these payments happen. And so consolidated list of subscriptions on your banking portal would really help.
Right. So thanks for this conversation, Bharat. If you have any closing comments, please go ahead. Otherwise, we can close for this episode.
Nothing. I would just like to see that, I don't have to pay this additional 30% commission to these big platforms. So you see CCI trying to enforce a lot of antitrust regulation against these platforms, saying that they're charging too high commission. And on the other hand, we're being forced into these platforms. We're being forced to pay these kind of commissions. So a good thing would be to see that, these just work and you're not forced to, transact through these platforms. So yeah, that's my.
And also RBI is a responsive regulator. I mean, It might be slow, but nonetheless, it's still a responsive regulator. And we do hope that it puts an end to this recurring payments nightmare in the near future. Thanks once again, and thanks to our listeners for tuning in.
Thanks, everyone.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaInst or our website takshashila.org.in.